John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory,
Welcome to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is a reading of the history of the 72nd Indiana Volunteer Infantry of the Mounted Lightning Brigade. Chapter 16. November 28th to December 25th, 1862. March from Gallatin to Castilian Springs. Go into camp in exposed position. Rumors of Morgan's threatening movements. Fortifying. Rain and snow. Attack at Hartsville, and a 10-mile run to that place. Scenes on the fiery, bloody battleground. Removal to Bledsoe's Creek. The Great Battle approaching. The Emancipation Proclamation. Wilder assumes command. Move camp again. Go in swimming on Christmas Day. On the 28th, our brigade moved from Gallatin, about 10 miles southeast to Castilian Springs, and camped in the most beautiful place we had yet occupied. The ground was high and rolling, covered with beautiful timber and blue grass. This place is about halfway between Gallatin and Hartsville, the latter being the extreme outpost on the east of Rosecrans' army. We moved to Castilian Springs to support Colonel Moore's brigade of our division, which was at Hartsville. Bragg's army had made a stand at Murfreesboro, 20 miles due south of Hartsville. Hence both Hartsville and Castilian Springs might be attacked at any time. We devoted the first few days in this camp to fixing everything up in neat order, having hints that we would most likely remain in it all winter. The inevitable drill was again instituted. On the 30th, we had our first brigade inspection, and invoiced to the satisfaction of Lieutenant Crick. He simply remarked that some of the men were careless in numbering their knapsacks, and that if he were not well acquainted with the character of the 72nd for taking care of their property, he would be led to think, by some of the numbers, that somebody had stolen something. But as he found other regiments afflicted with the same carelessness, it was not best to attempt to correct the mistake. On the 29th of November, the 10th Indiana marched from Hartsville and camped near us, having been relieved at that place by Colonel Moore's brigade of our division, consisting of the 106th and the 108th Ohio Infantry and the 105th Illinois Infantry, and 2 guns of the 13th Indiana Battery. The infantry were so largely composed of Germans that we called them the Dutch Brigade. When the 10th left Hartsville, they told the Dutch Brigade that Morgan would get them inside of a week if they did not look a leetle out. We shall see what we shall see. On December 6th, P.S. Nowlin died in camp of congested measles, which he took at Frankfort. He was the first man in the regiment and, so far as we know, the only one buried with honors of war. The poor fellow was a loyal Tennessee refugee who lived at Carthage, only 30 miles from where he died. Rumors of Morgan dashing hither and thither are in the air again, and again our blood is up, as we remember how near we were to the old fox once, and every man is on his mettle to prevent a surprise. Every gun is quietly loaded and ready. We begin to fortify our camp with big log breastworks. The pickets are doubled, vedettes thrown well out, and every man ordered to remain in camp where he can seize his musket and fall in at the sound of the long roll. Lieutenant Ruger, of Company C, while working on the breastworks, was ruptured and resigned on December 1st. It was hourly expected that Morgan would cross the Cumberland River at the ford between Hartsville and Castilian Springs and attack one or the other of the posts, but no one knew which he would choose. On Friday the 5th, it rained, hailed, and snowed. On Saturday the 6th, it was cloudy and quite cold, with 3 inches of snow on the ground, under which was a crust of ice. On Sunday morning, the 7th, just at daylight, we were aroused by the sound of cannonading in the direction of Hartsville. Instantly every man is up and all know that the post at that place is attacked. The men of the various companies seize their arms and fall in without orders from their officers. The officers buckle on their swords and join their companies without orders from the colonel. In 5 minutes from hearing the first gun, the regiment is ready to march. Colonel Miller dashes over to the tent of Colonel Harlan, commanding the brigade to which the 10th is attached, and tells the colonel that Hartsville is attacked, and suggests that as Harlan is the senior colonel, he take the lead and march at once to its relief. Colonel Harlan replies, "Yes, I guess it is attacked. And you, Colonel Miller, had better march to its relief, and I'll follow as soon as I can get my men up." Colonel Miller says, "No, you have been there, know the ground and can go quicker." "My men are not up yet. You go on and I'll soon follow," replies Colonel Harlan. At this time, the cannon roared louder on the crisp morning air. Every minute was an hour to the 72nd, and a fatal delay for the attacked post. Colonel Miller dashed back to the regiment and shouted, "Forward! March!" And we were off on double quick, in less than 25 minutes from the firing of the first gun, through the snow, moving for Hartsville. The ground was not only covered with snow and ice, but also rough with stones, many of which were flat and loose and would turn and slip under our feet. As the sun came up, the snow began to melt and clogged on our feet, and the road became sloppy and slippery. Sometimes we marched with lines extended on either side of the road, upsetting fences as we came to them to get them out of the way, for the ground was new to us, and once or twice word came that Morgan's force was dashing down upon us. When 5 miles from Hartsville, a force of the enemy's cavalry are seen up the road, and we suppose the attack will be made. Our lines of battle is quickly formed, a shell or two thrown amongst the rebels, and they put out for Hartsville with all speed. When we saw these rebels, we were commanded to load, though most of the guns were already loaded, and Captain La Follette commanded, "Attention, company! Load by the 9 commandments! Load!" The men knew what he was driving at and drove their balls well home. Then, falling into column in the sloppy road, we hurried forward again, the field officers exhorting us to greater speed. Close to Hartsville, we meet a squad of Negroes, bareheaded, barefooted, and almost naked, their clothes in ribbons. "Where is Morgan?" we shout to them. "Da, da, da," they reply as they point their fingers towards Hartsville. On we go, on, until many a man falls headlong from utter exhaustion and cannot get up. We are at the foot of the hill near Hartsville. "For God's sake, hurry up, do hurry up," shouts Colonel Kirkpatrick as he gallops along our column. We see a great smoke burst from the woods above us, and make another desperate effort to go faster. Captain Pinkerton, and running up the hill, steps upon a rock, his foot slips, and he is sent forward upon his hands and feet, and finally flat into the slush. But the brave fellow gathers up, seizes his groin with his hand, and is off again. We run through a thick wood, burst into an open field, and behold! The tents are on fire, the flames shooting high into the air, and the dead are strewn so thickly on the ground that we stumble over them. The cries from the tents attract our attention, and we began to rescue the wounded and sick from the flames. The 72nd is called upon to support 2 pieces of Captain Nicklin's artillery, which command the Cumberland forward, and which open fire upon Morgan's forces as they hasten over the river. And one shot sends one of his wagons high into the air, and makes his forces scamper off at full speed. His artillery sent 2 or 3 shots of grape and canister back, but soon limber up and get out of the way of our artillery. Once more, we see Morgan running from us. The 72nd had made 10 miles in 2 hours, getting in ahead of Harlan's veterans full a half hour, though they made remarkably good time. To explain, this was one of Morgan's dashes. Half his force crossed the Cumberland between Castilian Springs and Hartsville, and quietly surrounded the camp in the night on the west and north. The other half crossed above Hartsville, and came quietly in on the northeast, and when the attack was made, others crossed at the camp. So noiselessly was this done that the camp was completely surrounded before the attack was made. The attack began at daylight. The pickets of Colonel Moore's forces were thrown out but a little distance, and when the attack was made, there was little time to form and make resistance, as the rebels came in on all sides with their fearful yell and volleys of musketry. The Illinois regiments made out to form a line and made considerable resistance, and the men of Nicklins' 2 guns had made a brave fight. One of the lieutenants lay dead where the piece stood, with a 6-shooter in his hand, the chambers empty and several rebels dead around him. He had sold his life dearly. On the west of the camp, there had been hard fighting, and the lines of battle of both forces could be traced by dead rebels and dead Union men. The whole affair was the result of a sad piece of carelessness in not keeping the picket force strong and thrown well out from the camp, and not keeping vedettes well out and all around. Not a particle of fortifying was done, and the camp was exposed on all sides. Some of the wounded men told us that on account of the nights being so cold and snowy, it was thought impossible for the enemy to move, and there was but a very light camp guard on. Some of the rebels, who were wounded, fell into our hands, said that Morgan had intended to attack Castilian Springs, but on reconnoitering, found the picket lines so heavy, well advanced and wide awake, and found the fortifications so strong that he concluded to fall upon the careless fellows at Hartsville. The rebels captured some 2,000 prisoners, and almost all the arms of the brigade, including 2 guns of Nicklins' 13th Indiana Battery. Morgan's forces in this action consisted of 5 regiments of cavalry, 2 infantry regiments, and 1 battery. The rebel loss was 125 killed and wounded, 40 of their dead and some wounded being left on the field. The Union killed and wounded were considerably more. As soon as the enemy is gone and the fire extinguished, we proceed to burial of friend and foe, digging long graves and laying in each 6 or 8 side by side, wrapped up in their blankets. When it was possible to find a man's name, we wrote it on a pine stick, in large plain letters, and carefully wrapped it up to preserve the pencil marks and put it in his blanket. We ascertained the names of most of the Union soldiers, from letters or memoranda on their persons. But we could ascertain the names of but few of the rebel soldiers, for they had few letters or memoranda on their persons. We laid the Union soldiers in graves by themselves, and the rebel soldiers in graves by themselves. This work occupied the whole day and until after night. The wounded were cared for as far as possible, and removed to Gallatin. There was one poor fellow, through whose head a ball had passed just behind his eyes, and thrown both eyes out upon his cheeks. He was perfectly conscious. A little rebel, in a neat butternut suit, lay with his face on the ground, his hands spread out, and in the right hand a common hunting rifle, with wooden ramrod, while about his soldiers was the home-made powder horn and shot pouch. We turned him over to carry him to his grave. On his fair young face was the enthusiastic smile he bore in the charge, when a ball pierced his heart. He was a mere boy, with flaxen hair, and had no doubt furnished his own arms from his father's gun-rack. In front of him lay a young adjutant of an Ohio regiment, also on his face, his head pierced with a ball, his revolver in his hand. Little doubt these 2 had fired simultaneously, and each killed the other. Another poor fellow had 1/4 of the top of his head shot off with a grape shot, or piece of shell. He had crawled to the side of an old stump, where he sat shivering with cold and singing and talking in wild delirium. He was alive the last time we saw him late in the afternoon. The rebels left behind them an old country doctor, with long red tangled hair and beard. He was dirty, ignorant and bigoted, a fine specimen of backwoods butternut rebel. We made him our prisoner and treated him kindly. As he walked over the battlefield, he came to a place where lay a number of dead Union soldiers who were pierced with balls, their blood coagulated in pools in the mud and snow. He halted, lifted up his hands, and said with an expression of great delight, "Thank God for this! It has been a glorious day for the Southern cause." Several guns were leveled at the old brute's breast, and but for the interposition of an officer, he would have been shot dead in his tracks. He had to be taken out of sight to be kept from death. This was our first experience on a bloody battlefield, where fire and sword had done its work, where the blood was smoking, the wounded groaning and writhing in agony. And to tell the truth, it had a very serious effect. We all concurred in the sage remark of Buddy Burns, Company G, the big mule driver, who solemnly said, "Well, boys, to see sich a sight as that makes a feller feel danged glad that he's religious." About 8 o'clock at night, we started back to our camp at Castilian Springs, as tired a set of troops as ever tried to march. The night was cold and the road icy and slippery. Some got back about midnight, but many others did not get in until daylight. We spoke of Captain Pinkerton slipping and falling. He ruptured himself seriously in that fall, but the brave fellow kept up and did duty all day in burying the dead, and marched back to camp and was severely attacked by erysipelas next day. The sick list was largely increased by this trying affair. On the next day, the 8th, all was quiet, but a sharp lookout was kept. On the 9th we began in earnest to fortify more extensively, as Morgan, flushed with success, might dash down upon us. On the 10th, General Dumont, who had been with us for 6 months, was relieved by General Joseph J. Reynolds, and went home. We were sorry to lose the brave, wise, and witty Dumont. We shall never see his like again. He carried with him the warm affection of every man in the division, and especially in the 72nd. He had been elected to Congress, where he did as noble service as he had done in the field. Before the witty and gallant general leaves, we must tell his last passage at arms of wit. One day, Lieutenant Colonel Kirkpatrick, who commanded the regiment while Colonel Miller was commanding the brigade, was directed by General Dumont to take the 72nd to a certain place on the line. The colonel rode up to the regiment, which stood at order arms and faced to the front, and without ceremonies said, "Attention, boys! Follow me to the place the general has pointed out," and started to ride to the place himself. General Dumont said, "Colonel, had you not better command your battalion to shoulder arms and face right?" Colonel Kirkpatrick said, in a good-natured, careless manner, "It don't make a damned bit of difference, General. Don't you see they're coming all right? They know just what I want 'em to do, and will do it too." The colonel was correct. The regiment had promptly shouldered arms, faced about, and was at his horse's heels when General Dumont spoke. "Well, if there's a mutual understanding between you, it don't make a damned bit of difference, sure enough," said General Dumont, with his intimidable squint and nasal, and rode quietly away, fully satisfied that 72nd and her brave lieutenant colonel understood each other in plain English, and were not going to balk over a pebble of tactics in the way of duty. There is more than a mere witty passage between the general and the colonel in the above. It illustrates the secret of the strength and discipline of the volunteer troops of the United States. They were not long in the field before intelligent officers comprehended what should be done and how to do it properly, whether they understood the language of the tactics or not. They made their intelligent soldiers understand them. There was a mutual understanding, and hence a unity of action and effective execution. The 72nd always understood the gallant Colonel Kirkpatrick, as the sequel will show. On the 11th, we were called up and formed line of battle long before day, stacked arms and went to work on the fortifications. Hall's brigade of our division and Wolford's cavalry reported to Colonel Miller for duty. Since the fate of Hartsville, we are on the extreme left of the army, and the way into Kentucky via Hartsville is open to the enemy. On the 12th, we were still under arms. On the 13th, General Reynolds visited the camp and pronounced it untenable, there being some high points from which he said the rebels could shell us out in 2 hours. We hardly thought so, and hated to lose all our hard work, but we must obey our general. And he ordered us to move about 2 miles west onto higher ground, near Bledsoe's Creek, to which place we removed camp on the 14th of December. Here we lay without fortifications, being often called up in the night to form line of battle and lie for hours on our arms, and frequently we could hear the clatter of the hoofs of the rebel cavalry on the pike in the vicinity of our camp. On the night we left our old Castilian camp, rebels came into it. They were hovering about thick as flies in August, watching their opportunity to pounce down upon us. On December 14th, Sergeant McClure, with 36 men, was put on picket between our present camp and the one just vacated at Castilian Springs, and they formed a part of a chain picket on that and the south side of our camp. They had a cornfield in their front, and after night were ordered to fire on, with halting, anything that approached from that direction. About midnight a movement was heard in the field, and the men began firing and kept it up at intervals till morning, when, just at daylight, Captain Hanna, who was officer of the day, came tearing out to see what was the matter and to cheer us up. When we found out in the field a gang of jacks and generals quietly feeding on the cornstalks. It seems amusing now, but we failed to see the fun then. The main topic amongst the soldiers was the advance of Rosecrans from Nashville to Bragg's army at Murfreesboro. We all knew that a great battle was soon to be fought there. It was in those days of folly, when the generals of our great armies told all the newspaper correspondents what they were going to do, and how they were going to do it, and thus notified the rebels in advance of all our movements. This was very convenient for the rebels, but death on Union soldiers. This battle was approaching, and day by day we could hear the firing of the artillery, skirmishing of the two great armies, and day by day we expected to be ordered to the front. Another topic of conversation was the 100-day Emancipation Proclamation, which was to go into effect by the issuance of another on the next New Year's, now almost come, proclaiming all the slaves of rebels free. Would the president adhere to his purpose, or would he recede? Some thought he ought to recede, as the attempted enforcement of such a proclamation would only make the rebels resist more desperately to save their millions of dollars worth of slaves. Others held that the president should be firm in his purpose, and as the slaves were the property of the rebels and a source of strength to the rebellion, we should confiscate them and put them in the Union Army to work and to fight. What he did the world knows, and the world in heaven approves his noble act. On the 20th of December, Colonel Woolford made a reconnaissance towards Hartsville and found the rebel pickets occupying that place. At this time it had been quite well ascertained that when the battle should begin between Rosecrans and Bragg's armies, Morgan would be sent with a heavy and fleet force to play havoc in the rear, destroy trains, capture and destroy supplies, cut the railroad and telegraph, and interrupt communication in all possible ways. On the 22nd of December, Colonel Wilder of the 17th Indiana joined our brigade and took command. The 72nd always regarded this as an insult to Colonel Miller, who had commanded the brigade from the time we left Frankfort, and had commanded it well, being liked and trusted by all the regiments of the brigade. But rank was rank, and Colonel Miller came back to the regiment, which had been commanded all this time by the brave and generous Lieutenant Colonel Kirkpatrick. As soon as Wilder assumed command, the 25th, he ordered us to move camp further southwest onto the top of the hill in the woods, which was, we think, a good position. On the 25th, Christmas Day, it was warm and pleasant as a May day. The birds sang. The spiders, flies, gnats, mosquitoes, and all their kinfolks were out in force, and several of the 72nd went in swimming and reported the water very pleasant. Chapter 17 we will get to in the next episode. All right, let's get into our show notes. Very interesting episode. We've got a lot to talk about. Let's get right into it. All right, so let's look at our notes here and set the scene not only for the battle, but for everything else that's going on. This is the very beginning of what would later become known as the Stones River Campaign, and this is the opening salvo, is what they're talking about in this battle right here. First off, while the Union Army units that's at Hartsville are surprised, it's a battle. These guys aren't in bed, right? They don't detect the approach of the Union or of the Confederate soldiers, but when the Confederates do arrive, they are ready for battle. Now, they had initially, Morgan, when he presented this idea to his commander, Bragg, he was like, hey, there's only 1,500 Union soldiers here. Let's go. So he's like, all right, go for it. So Morgan borrows 2 regiments for the raid. They're the 2nd and 9th Kentucky Infantry regiments. They're from the Orphan Brigade. So veterans. And his total force is increased by about 2,100 men. But by the time they get to the battle, it's about 1,500. Maybe, somewhere around there. And he's got, of course, his 7th, 8th, 11th Kentucky Cavalry regiments, 2 batteries of artillery, and the attached 9th Tennessee Cav. This combined Confederate force moves across the river at 2 points, but they arrive in Lebanon just hours after Union cavalry troopers had been there. And they didn't report anything, they didn't see nothing, so they turned around and went back to camp. So they basically came in on the heels of a patrol. And that night, they would cross the Cumberland River. So it's a pretty interesting battle. As the rebels get within a half mile of the Union encampment before they're challenged for the first time. And that means the Yankees, a half mile, I'm assuming rebels are on the move. So you probably got about 4 minutes to get ready. 5 minutes to get ready, maybe less. And you know what? They did it. The 108th, the 104th, the 106th Ohio, with Cav on both flanks, are formed into line of battle, and they're ready to meet the foe. And they got their 2 cannons posted behind them. And it was a battle. The fighting seems to have lasted for max an hour. The descriptions of the battle. Anyway, there's a lot of conflicting reports, we should say, about how this battle turned out. So eventually, the Union line collapses. But judging by the casualties they talk about, the intensity of the battle must have been sharp and close. And the Union Brigade commander, he gets sacrificed over this. Just kicked out of the army. Goodbye. And the perspective of this little-known battle is certainly really interesting. The Confederates go back victorious with all of these battle standards and all these prisoners, and Jefferson Davis is there to congratulate them. It's crazy. But just be aware, when you're researching this battle, no 2 things even make sense. It was very interesting to come across. I know you see that prevalent in a lot of battles, but here it's just so varied. It's wild to see what actually happened, or try and figure out what actually happened. Because even the perspective we are told in this history is different from what I have read elsewhere. Just absolutely wild. So let's get back to the 72nd. It's really good to see them becoming a professional fighting regiment, and we're going to hear about that in the future. But it's just lovely to see and hear about the development. And certainly a better way to incorporate, or to be incorporated into war, than how many other regiments are just thrown into combat for the first time. These guys are really getting acclimated to the contest, so we'll see how it works out for them. Oh, and just in case you weren't aware what a jack and gentle was, those are donkeys. Somebody's talking about they're being on picket and they're shooting into the corn because the corn was moving. They were shooting at just hungry donkeys, which I think is really hilarious. And also, Wilder joins the Brigade for the first time, and we're going to talk about him for a moment. Something I think we can very, something I think of when I think of the Wilder Brigade is something very recent that happened, which was Marjorie Taylor Greene going onto the Wilder Brigade monument and thinking it was the Confederate Wilder Brigade. Just so embarrassing. When will treason just not be cool? Is it anyone? My goodness. All right. So, John Thomas Wilder, he's born January 31st, 1830, in the Catskill Mountains in New York. His entire lineage in America was that of soldiers, every single generation. His great-grandfather lost a leg at Bunker Hill, and his grandfather took his place in the Continental Army. His own father, Reuben Wilder, fought in the War of 1812. So, I'm not going to get too much into it, but this history will certainly cover his exploits for sure. But he comes from, soldierly, brave men, it would seem. So we'll see how that plays out. All right, and that's it for the rest of my notes, Mush Eaters. It was a very interesting chapter. I guess you can only, if you look up the Battle of Stones River, you can only imagine what is coming when you compare the dates from what we're talking about and what's about to happen. So stay tuned for the next chapter. It's certainly going to be interesting. Thank you for listening. I will catch you in the next episode. And my friends, have a great one. It's going to be a beautiful fall, I think. All right, bye-bye now.
Old John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on.